Thank you very much, Penny. As Penny says, I've worked for Shropshire Council and its predecessor, Shropshire County Council, for nigh on 20 years now. And in that time, I've held various roles. And latterly, I've been working as a team manager, but also as an archaeological planning advisor. And my talk today is really going to be explaining about how archaeology works within the planning process. First of all, and give you a little bit of an overview to that, and then use three sort of reasonably detailed case studies to illustrate, the results of the sort of work that's undertaken as part of the planning process. And some of the sites that we'll be talking about will be familiar to you because there are the sort of technical publications, if you like, that have been published recently in the transactions of the Society for two of the sites, and one is still pending. Okay, so if we make a start, archaeology has been turning up really throughout history as part of the development process, and that's certainly the case within Shropshire. This is an axiomatic diagram drawn by Thomas Telford, one of our sort of famous former employees of the council. Actually, he was appointed as our highway surveyor or road surveyor for the authority. And during the construction of a road between Shrewsbury via Atcham and Ironbridge, he traversed the site of Wroxeter and uncovered this Roman hypocaust and baths complex within the centre of the Roman town. And this is really quite a detailed level of recording of the building remains that he found during those road works or highway works. Really published to quite a high standard. Uncovered in 1788, as a slide indicates, and finally published in 1838. But this archaeology remained very much a sort of antiquarian pursuit for the large part, sort of descriptive accounts of monuments throughout most of the 19th century until the latter half of the century, and really through the influence of a number of key characters in the later 19th and early 20th century. Archaeology began to emerge as a much more scientific and investigative discipline, and largely pursued through the excavation process. And there are two figures on this slide. On the left, you've got Augustus Lane Fox, or otherwise known as General Pitt Rivers, who owned a large landed estate on Cranbourne Chase in Dorset. Had a military background, was a high-ranking soldier throughout most of his career, but also sort of as a gentleman landowner had a significant interest in archaeology and human origins, and also a fascination with sort of military remains from the prehistoric period onwards. And as part of his sort of inheritance of his estate and his sort of, if you like, retirement from his military career, pursued a very sort of innovative program of excavations on his estate, which led to the sort of development of a particular set of archaeological excavation techniques and methods of recording the remains that he was revealing on his estate. So really a very innovative figure, if you like, in the earlier part of the history of the discipline. And then on into the 20th century, archaeology became increasingly sort of, in the first half of the century, underpinned as a university discipline. And instrumental in that was the work of a number of early sort of pioneers in the 20th century sort of history of the discipline, typified really by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who you've got this rather natty-looking character on the right-hand side of the slide. But he was working alongside a whole range of other figures: Christopher Hawkes, Tessa Wheeler, his first wife, Jaquetta Hawkes. And within Shropshire, indeed, our very own Lily Chitty was quite pivotal in the earlier parts development of the discipline at this time. But Mortimer Wheeler is often noted because of the role he played in developing excavation techniques. And he sort of started out as an archaeologist working prior to the First World War, and obviously his career, if you like, was interrupted by the First World War. He joined the military at that time as an officer, was active on the Western Front, and went back to archaeology after the First World War, and was, undertook key excavations in the 1920s and on into the 1930s, and then was subsequently went back into the military in the Second World War as a tank officer, I believe, and then operated subsequent to the Second World War as well, but very much a sort of leader in the development of field techniques and excavation techniques, alongside, as I say, a cohort of colleagues at that time, both male and female archaeologists. But through that work, Mortimer Wheeler's work, the sort of what we would recognise as many of the principles of excavation techniques were really pioneered, but it remained really on into the post-war period, very much a sort of academic discipline first and foremost. Really, there wasn't really a large body of archaeologists working outside the academic sector at that time, other than within a small number of people working within the Ministry of Works as part of that government department. And really, up into the post-war period, we see the development of a number of heritage protections through statutory mechanisms, the way in which archaeology is afforded, if you like, legal protection. And first and foremost of those are scheduled monuments. Really, the legislation, the Ancient Monuments Act that underpinned that, first began to develop in the 1880s, and Mortimer Wheeler, General Pitt Rivers, indeed, was one of the first inspectors of ancient monuments under that legislation. And that developed through successive acts across the 20th century, culminating in the present act, which is the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act 1979. Following the Second World War, we see the development of the town and country planning system, and within that, a series of protections for listed buildings, so the statutory list of buildings, which were developed after the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, and latterly from the 1960s onwards under the Civic Amenities Act, the concept of area designations that we know of as conservation areas. Also, we've got the development of other types of area designations, the registered parks and gardens, and also through international conventions, World Heritage Sites. They don't necessarily have any legal status as such, other than through the planning system, but they are enshrined through our treaty conventions under UNESCO. But it's estimated that despite these various legal protections, between 95 and 99% of all archaeological sites actually fall outside of those various legal protections. They are not subject to any specific legal protections, other than through latterly through the planning system, really, and being a consideration within that. And I'll explain really how archaeology came to be a consideration in the planning system. And really, the development within British town centres really accelerated after the Second World War, obviously as a result of the aerial bombardment that many of our cities underwent during the war, and obviously the initial clearance and redevelopment of bomb sites led to the exposure of archaeological remains, and perhaps most famously within London at the Temple of Mithras at Walbrook in the centre of London, and that was excavated by an archaeologist called W.F. Grimes, who was working, I believe, partly alongside the Ministry of Works. And his excavation in the mid-1950s, 1954, was really a sensation. It drew very large numbers of people and visitors to the excavations. You can see in the top left-hand corner of this slide an image of people visiting those excavations whilst that site was under investigation by Grimes. And actually, this particular site has really quite an interesting sort of afterlife, if you like, because the remains of the temple were moved and reconstructed at a new site at Temple Court. And then most recently, they've been moved again back to their original site at Walbrook and incorporated into the new Bloomberg HQ. And actually, there's well, when restrictions permit, you can actually visit that site, and there's a sort of whole new interpretation element that's been built into that site now within the new Bloomberg HQ, and that's been publicised, through the British Archaeology and various national sort of publications recently. The pace of sort of redevelopment and development really accelerated, of course, across the course of the latter half of the 20th century, perhaps characterised by the ever-expanding demand for sands and gravels to supply the construction industry. And you can see down in the bottom left-hand corner of that slide, archaeologists working on a gravel quarry site in the 1960s. Very large areas of sands and gravels being quarried in the post-war period along the Thames Valley, for example, up in the areas of the East Midlands, Leicestershire, and so forth. And that led to the sort of an increasing sort of move towards salvaging archaeology in advance of that sort of extractive processes and redevelopment, which really culminated in the rescue archaeology movement in the 1970s, most famously, through the publication of this sort of polemic work by Philip Raatz, really sort of, if you like, codifying the sort of key principles of the rescue archaeology movement, this sort of desire and public feeling that archaeology should be investigated and recorded and excavated in advance of redevelopment and development activities. But nonetheless, archaeology really remained a sort of game of smoke and mirrors in many ways up into the 1980s. And we saw in the 1980s, again, a number of key redevelopment projects in a number of sort of historic English city and town centres, which really brought archaeology to the fore again in the public imagination. And on the left-hand side here, you can see the investigations in the centre of York at the Coppergate site, really, which exposed the sort of Viking era levels within the city, which, and fantastic levels of preservation on that site as well, organic preservation, timbers, and leather work, and huge amounts of environmental evidence for sort of the remains of food production and so forth, recovered from that site, and famously sort of led to the development of the Jorvik Centre in York. But actual negotiating access for archaeologists onto these sites was very much a game of sort of persuasion, to persuade the developers to enable archaeologists to undertaking work on these sites prior to the construction process taking place. And there wasn't actually any sort of formal onus, if you like, on the developers to provide archaeologists with access. It was very much a product of negotiation. But nonetheless, archaeology at the same time developing as an ever more sort of professionalised discipline outside of the university sector. But nonetheless, the numbers of sort of excavations that were undertaken in advance of development remained relatively small. But by the latter 1980s, the site that really brought this to the fore and led to sort of significant public lobbying, if you like, of the government of the day was the uncovering of the excavations of the Rose Theatre in London. And that led to a large body of lobbying, including, sort of celebrity names, Lawrence Gielgud, John Gielgud, amongst others, lobbying the government to persuade them that really archaeology should be a consideration in the development process, and really there should be a requirement on developers to enable archaeologists to investigate sites before they were developed and redeveloped. And that sort of lobbying movement really culminated in the publication in 1990 of a piece of planning policy guidance, Planning Policy Guidance Note 16, or PPG 16 as it's commonly known, which really for the first time made archaeology what's known as a material consideration in the planning process. In other words, when you're making a planning decision, you have to actually take into account the likelihood and the possibility that archaeological remains exist on a development site, and actually take that into account in making your planning decisions. And it's introduced some key concepts into the planning process in terms of the way in which archaeology should be investigated, and that's this concept of the polluter pays, which was a sort of emergent strand in environmental planning regulation during the 70s and 80s. And that's basically that effectively the developer has to pay for that investigative process as part of the cost of redeveloping a site or developing a site. So that's really fundamental in terms of underpinning the financial side, if you like, of that investigative process. Prior to this, it really very much operated on a shoestring, you know, public fundraising activities, and you know, on a very small scale as a consequence of that. It also introduced the concept of preservation in situ, where remains were really important and had to be preserved and accommodated within the development process, and that might be achieved either through avoidance, perhaps in the first instance, i.e. not developing an area where particularly important archaeological remains exist, or perhaps accommodating them within, say, a foundation design. And also the concept of preservation by record. In other words, excavating and recording thoroughly archaeological remains before they're lost as a result of the development process, which is ultimately potentially a destructive process and removes remains before, you know, as a result of redevelopment. So this is the concept that archaeological remains have to be investigated and recorded and published before they are lost through development. And this really resulted in a huge sort of growth within the archaeological sector. And it really sort of turbocharged the development of archaeology as a professional discipline, you know, working alongside developers and the planning process, and particularly within the private sector. So the vast majority of archaeologists who are employed within the UK now are employed within the private sector, within commercial firms that are operating in response to the development process and alongside developers. Also, obviously, within the public sector, particularly within local authorities, it generated the need for professional archaeologists working alongside colleagues within the planning system to provide them with, you know, expert advice. Within the state agencies, within what the agency now known as Historic England, a sort of regulatory advisor on behalf of the government. And also, to a degree, within the university sector, in order to sort of provide the appropriate skill sets to generate this body of new professional archaeologists, if you like. But as I say, the vast majority of archaeologists are now employed outside of the university sector, either within the private sector and commercial consultancy and contractor units, or within local government. And really this was a sea change in terms of the amount of excavated information, excavated sites and information that was becoming evident and known and published gradually, but also in terms of the sheer amount of archaeological data that was being generated through these sites. And a large quantity of sites are not necessarily formally published. They become what's known as ultimately grey literature reports, which are collated within data sets such as the historic environments records, which, you know, local authorities also manage and curate. And that information is available to feed back into the planning process to inform planning decisions. It's available to researchers and volunteers, students, as well as to commercial archaeologists who are engaged in sort of investigating sites. And it helps to inform, for example, my role as a professional planning advisor within a local authority. You know, it tells me what investigation has been previously undertaken, what level of information was recovered, and I'll explain, you know, how that iterative process works really through some of the case studies I'll be telling you about in a moment. Just to illustrate and quantify, you know, that sea change, if you like, is this graph here showing, if you like, the number of archaeological investigation and excavations recorded in England by the former Royal Commission between 1980 and the publication around here in 1990 PPG 16, and you can see this huge acceleration and uptake in and uplift in numbers of excavations undertaken after the publication of PPG 16. And you can see, particularly in that sort of late 90s and early noughties, early to mid noughties sort of phase of investment and regeneration under the last Labour government, particularly within our city centres, just a huge increase in the number of excavations being undertaken after that, the publication of that piece of planning guidance. And it's to the extent now really that, particularly for large infrastructure and large scale developments, archaeology is very much an integrated part of the development process. This is a slide on the right here of a shaft being sunk as part of the Crossrail project in London. You may have seen recently the programmes on BBC Two in advance of the construction of HS2, just the huge scale of archaeological investigation and excavation, for example, in the centre of London next to Euston Station, of the cemetery site that needed to be cleared in advance of the construction of the extension to Euston Station to accommodate the HS2 London terminal. Just huge quantities of archaeologists on site, very large scale project budgets. But nonetheless, operating right down to the small scale, householder type extensions, my team has a role in overseeing those, all different scales of development, and providing archaeological advice in relation to them. And the most recent iteration of sort of the guidance that we're currently working under is the National Planning Policy Framework, published in 2012, replaced a very short-lived piece of legislation called PPS 5, Planning Policy Statement 5, which really moved forward the agenda from PPG 16, and the key concepts out of that are embedded within the National Planning Policy Framework. It's a much more integrated approach to archaeology and buildings, listed buildings, and really sort of underpins the work that my team now does within the local authority. And it does get quite a lot of bad press, actually, the National Planning Policy Framework, but actually in terms of the historic environment, it's relatively strong. And it's now supported by a raft of sort of guidance documents, both at the National Planning Practice Guidance, which you can see a slide of in the top right-hand corner of this slide, and an ever-growing raft of guidance from Historic England as well, in relation to codifying how the investigative process should take place and what the best stage within the development process that should occur in, which again that helps and underpins and guides the planning decisions that local authorities make on a day-to-day basis. So that really is a whistle-stop tour through how archaeology has sort of emerged as a consideration in the planning process, and the types of sort of guidance and legislation that underpins the sort of day-to-day decisions that myself and my colleagues, both within Shropshire and elsewhere, make. And I just want to go on now to give you some three sort of case studies of the sort of work that's been undertaken in recent years within Shropshire. And I'm going to make a start over in the east side of the county in Shifnal. Shifnal is obviously located just to the south of the M54 corridor, and in recent years the area between the eastern side of Telford and Wolverhampton has experienced quite a lot of pressure for new housing, not least in relation to, obviously, in response to the development of the JLR Land Rover site, and the growth of within the West Midlands itself. And obviously, commuting into the West Midlands conurbation and the motorway network generally has really stimulated that growth and pressure for development. But we've been engaged in sort of advising on various development sites, well, across the county, but within this area, one of which merged in 2013, 14, 15, is this area just to the south of the motorway, which we know as Houghton Road or Horton Road in Shifnal. Quite a large site between the existing northern edge of the town, urban edge of the town, and the motorway corridor. And as a result of the sort of developer promoting the site and bringing it forwards for development, we undertook or advised that it was necessary to undertake an initial evaluation exercise, or what we know as a troll trenching exercise. And you can see the layout in these blue lines, if you like, across this site, which is the layout of the evaluation trenching plan across that site. So each of these was an excavated evaluation trench. And that resulted in us focusing in many of these trenches, particularly in the northern part of the site, were largely blank, but we found some very interesting results in this southern end of the site, close to the existing edge of the town. And that allowed us to zone in on that area and undertake what's known as a strip, map and record exercise. That's basically stripping an area that you can see hatched in here and investigating and recording any archaeological remains that are found in this area. As I say, we were the planning advisors on this, so we were effectively specifying what work needed to take place on the site, but the actual investigations were undertaken by CGMS were the developer's consultants, so they were the archaeological consultants acting for the developer. So myself or my colleague were liaising very closely with them and agreeing what work needs to take place. And the archaeological contractor on this site was a commercial unit attached to Worcestershire County Council in this instance. And what we found on this site was really a multi-period range of activities spanning the prehistoric period and then on latterly into sort of medieval agricultural activity. You can see these green stripes on this slide, which represent the extent of medieval strip field cultivation across this area. It formed part of the medieval shiftnells open fields around the edge of the town, and those green stripe are the furrows of those medieval, the classic medieval strip fields. But the areas that really piqued our interest on this particular site were the pink sort of blobs, if you like, and orange spots on this map, which represent a series of pits and post holes which are widespread across this area. And you can see that a number of these were encountered in these evaluation trenches, and the results of that really allowed us to zone in, and the distribution of those allowed us to zone in on this area of the site and focus that as once the evaluation exercise has been undertaken as the key focus of investigations on this site. And these pits turned out to be of particular interest because of their prehistoric dating. We had a large cluster on the eastern side of this area of pits dating to the early part of the Neolithic period. That's the period of the New Stone Age, the Neolithic, when farming was first introduced into, or farming techniques and practices were first introduced into Britain. And that's the period that dates to roughly between 3,950 and 3,710 BC, and that's dated in this instance by radiocarbon dates, absolute scientific dating technique that was obtained from material recovered from these pits. So that's in the middle of the early part of the 4th millennium BC. And the finds from this particular group of pits included flint work. And we also recovered, and this is a slide of the sort of pits that you can see here, typical sort of shot of them under excavation here, relatively shallow, contained sort of a mixture of burnt material in some instances, and that's where we were able to obtain the dating evidence from. But we also found this stone item in one of them, which is an early Neolithic polissoir, or it's, in other words, that's the archaeological term for a stone that's used to polish stone axes. So you've got an evidence here of a stone that's used in the production of and polishing of stone axes. And polished stone axes are very if you like, one of the type finds from the early Neolithic period. And many of you be familiar with them if you've been into the museum and art gallery in Shrewsbury. There's quite a large collection of polished stone axes, some of which are on display within the museum, made of a wide range of different materials, including flint, obviously, but obviously various hard rock sources around the country, perhaps also famously typified by the Langdale Pike axe factory, very hard greeny material obtained from the Lake District. And there are a number of obviously pivotal stone sources within the UK and across Europe that stone axes were being quarried and produced from. This is an item, the polissoir is an item that's involved in the production of and the final stages of production of the stone axe, in terms of actually sort of polishing and refining it, if you like. But interestingly, that's turned up, an example of that has turned up on this site in Shifnal, which is suggestive of, this cluster of pits are very typical of Neolithic sites. It's one of the earliest or best known Neolithic sites now within the county. We have very, very few of sites of this date from Shropshire, and it's suggestive of some long-term, perhaps settlement-related activity taking place in this location. Moving back to our trench plan, on the western side of the site, we have another discrete cluster of pits in the western area, which actually dated to the latter part, the mid and latter part of the Neolithic period. So we've got, and the carbon dates were obtained from these pits dated to between 3,500 and 3,100 BC. And from these pits was also recovered a typical type of mid to late Neolithic pottery known as Mortlake style Peterborough ware. You can see this particular incised groove decoration along the rims of these vessels, which is very typical of that style of Neolithic pottery. And again, what we seem to have here is a very long-term focus on this area, this site, spanning the best part of the 4th millennium BC, really, typified by those two discrete clusters of pits. And that's not untypical of Neolithic sites elsewhere within the country, but it's highly unusual in a Shropshire context. And this is really perhaps one of the most important Neolithic sites we now have in Shropshire, actually, which has been excavated and investigated through the development process. Relatively modest in terms of the character of the archaeology here, but incredibly important in terms of what it tells us about Neolithic occupation and habitation and the longevity of that in some locations within the county. This site was also, as I said, it's a multi-period site. It seems to have fallen out of use in the Bronze Age, but we have evidence from the Iron Age period of its reuse again in the 1st millennium BC. And again, we have two discrete areas of activity on this site dating to the Iron Age period, starting in the earlier part of the Iron Age. On the east side of the site, we have a number of post-built structures here, which were producing iron slag, and from that were obtained a series of radiocarbon dates dating to the earlier part of the Iron Age. So the period between 790 BC and 540 BC. And that is actually quite unusual evidence from a Shropshire context. We don't have a great deal of evidence for earlier Iron Age occupation outside of potentially of the hill forts in Shropshire. The only other really site dated to this period exists on the south side of Shrewsbury and was excavated by Ernie Jenks in the 1960s, again in advance of house building activity there. But really, there are very few examples of sites of this date. And indeed, occupation evidence from the earlier part of the Iron Age is quite scarce nationally, let alone in a Shropshire context. But on the western side of the site, we also have another series of post-built buildings. You can see this plan form here, and a series of pits dating to the middle to late Iron Age, and again we obtained radiocarbon dates were obtained from those dating to the period 350 BC down to 50 BC. So that's the middle to later part of the Iron Age. And those pits contained, again, a range of finds, including burnt stone, daub. Now, daub is obviously a material that's used in buildings, fragments of animal bone, stone rubbers, and small quantities of animal bone were obtained from those. And what's interesting about this site, again in the Shropshire context, is it provides evidence for some form of settlement activity that appears to have been largely unenclosed and an open site. Now, we're very familiar, within Shropshire with enclosure sites that date to the Iron Age period. This is an example photographed in the last decade on Wenlock Edge, on the dip slope of the Wenlock Edge escarpment. And you can see this double ditch rectilinear enclosure. And of course, we have a wide range of these of all different shapes and forms. This is a very large example crop mark enclosure at Osbass and in northwestern Shropshire. See this triple ditched enclosure and these complex outworks radiating out from that. And we tend to think of these as very much the typical kind of Iron Age settlement sites on the lower ground in Shropshire. They range in size and scale from very small examples up to these complex examples, but we tend to think of them as very much the typical sort of farmstead type settlements in which the majority of people probably spent most of their lives in the Iron Age. But what we have at Houghton Road in Shifnal is an example of what appears to be an unenclosed settlement site, and they're very hard to identify because they don't tend to produce crop mark evidence which is visible from the air, but they also they're quite rare to find that type of evidence. And it makes us it makes us think as archaeologists that these crop mark sites aren't the only type of settlement that are out there in the Iron Age period. So that's another important result that the excavations at Shifnal have sort of prompted in terms of our thinking about the period. Now, moving on, but still in the same general part of the world, is this site at Red's Hill Reservoir, just on the eastern side of Telford. This is the line of the old A5 running through here, and you can see the built edge of Telford here. But in about 2010, 2011, Severn Trent Water, who have a reservoir site in this location, approached my colleagues in the local authority and asked for us advice that they needed to improve, I think, a nitrate filtration plant on this site to improve the quality of the water, drinking water from this site. It's a site that we know was inhabited in the Roman period. It's a site of a roadside town, Uxacona, and is subject, we know there was a Roman fort here, and subject to a certain amount of legal protection. These pink areas that you can hopefully see the outlines of on this slide are areas that are subject to scheduling. So they are subject to a high degree of legal protection under that 1979 Act, as I mentioned earlier. But there are also areas of this site, and we know from previous investigations and finds in this location that there's also areas of this settlement that fall outside of those scheduled areas, which are perhaps less well investigated, but nonetheless we know have significant potential for archaeological remains. And to a large degree, the areas that Severn Trent were interested in, this is a reservoir, focus of the reservoir facility here, lay largely outside of that scheduled area. This is just to give you the location of that, if you like, in the Roman road network and settlement pattern. Uxacona is located there, sort of midway between Penacorium and Penkridge and Viraconium or Wroxeter, on this sort of key Watling Street road alignment here. And you can see its location in terms of its wider regional context there as well on that slide. As I say, this is another slide showing the sort of area of interest here. This is a Severn Trent facility now on the ground, the pink are the scheduled areas. And Severn Trent were really interested in this area here, and in terms of the nitrate plant they needed to build at this time. And they approached us in, as I say, 2010, 2011, and we advised that they were going to need to undertake an archaeological evaluation. And as a consequence of the findings of that, advised on an area excavation, actually, in advance of the construction of the new nitrate filtration plant. And we were able to zone in really in here in terms of previous investigations of the fort site in this area on the frontage of the site, and a sort of pipeline connection, if you like, that was going to be the focus of this area of investigation. You can see the access road here, and then the site of the plant itself here. And this revealed really quite significant and extensive evidence in the area under investigation of a roadside settlement that developed in relation to the fort and subsequently to Watling Street, the Roman road of Watling Street. And the sequence on this site really started in the Roman period, in the military period before AD 70, and it's developed a series of evidence for activity in a series of areas across here, typified really by this pit containing a large Spanish olive oil amphory. You can see that under excavation here. And it produced evidence, and you can see evidence again of a series of ditches that were associated with this military phase here under excavation in this slide. And it produced evidence for a wide array of military period finds. So we had a substantial quantity of military pottery, very similar to the finds that are found obviously from the legionary fortress of Wroxeter. An array of brooches, typified of military sort of associated brooches, such as this one on the slide here. And also by one of the most intriguing finds of this glass, a fragment from a glass vessel, which is a head of the Roman god Bacchus, which was actually detached from the vessel and then subsequently curated and deliberately removed, probably because of its decorative qualities from that glass vessel. And then after that military phase, in phase 2 of the site, we see the development of a roadside settlement proper, if you like. A series of plots fronting onto the road itself, boundary divisions, subdividing them, and then evidence for activity within the back, if you like, the back plot areas of the site. And that's we think in the period between the early 2nd century and early 3rd century, the settlement at this site we think extended potentially up to 16 hectares in extent. That's quite, it's quite a significant area. The plots, as I say, take recognition of the military sort of boundaries that have developed, but are very much sort of orientated on Watling Street, with buildings probably constructed gable end onto the street, if you like, and then running back on a axis through into the back plot areas. And in terms of the excavated areas, it largely missed the frontage of those buildings, but it certainly revealed elements that the rear ranges and the back plot areas of the site. And within those back plot areas, found evidence for a series of ovens relating to sort of industrial type production activities that were going on in the back plot areas of some of these roadside settlements. And what we think from the evidence we've got here is effectively almost a service station type settlement that's developed alongside the road to service the needs of travellers moving along and backwards and forwards along Watling Street. Just as in terms of an acknowledgement again of the other people involved in the investigation of this site, the archaeological consultant in this case were Mott MacDonald, and the archaeological contractors were again actually Worcestershire County Council Archaeology Unit in this instance. And you can see on this sort of detailed plan of the site here, we've got highlighted in yellow one of these ovens, and again another oven set within a building in this instance on this other part of the site. And that's an example of those features under excavation. You can see here this very sort of extensive heat effective burning of the surrounding ground and soils. Again, some lining in here of one of those oven kiln features. And again, this produced a substantial amount of pottery and finds. Again, a wide array of sort of Roman pottery, largely characterized by Severn Valley wares. That's the kind of typical regional day-to-day sort of pottery, if you like, that typifies the Severn Valley area and the surrounding region. Also a range of vessels from elsewhere, particularly Samian, coming from central France, so central southern France. Black Samian ware. That's an example of one of the objects that was recovered from the site, and this decorative piece of black Samian ware. And this is a figure of Aeneas, and if I can get the pronunciation right, Anachises. Aeneas, of course, was the founder of Rome, and he's carrying his father Anachises away from the fall of Troy on his shoulders. So this is very much a classical mythological scene being depicted on the side of this Roman vessel here. We also have evidence, interestingly, on this site of very much a heavily, if you like, Romanized lifestyle. The inhabitants of this site were very much keyed into the classical development of Britain, the Roman development of Britain. This is an object, a stylus here, and also this evidence here of a lozenge-shaped seal box. And note, these are both instruments that are, or finds that are typical of writing and literacy. So, we have evidence on this site that, of illiterate inhabitants in this location as well. And again, typical of that sort of integration of this site, if you like, into the Roman world. In the latter part of the history of this site, there's a large ditch that is constructed to the rear of the site in the late 2nd century. So this is a slight change in the way this settlement was being organised and managed, if you like. And indeed, after the early 3rd century, the area that was under investigation seems to have been largely abandoned. So whether the construction of this ditch in the late 2nd century represents some attempt to try and fortify the site, or defend it to a certain degree, and you can see that's a substantial ditch there, and led to some, that uncertainty led to some sort of contraction of the settlement. It certainly seems to be the case from the evidence within the area that was excavated. But the ditch itself remained open and was only backfilled really at the end of the 4th century or the early 5th century. So certainly there seems to be evidence of activity at this site running on towards the end of the Roman period, but not characterized by any sort of settlement within the area that was under investigation, at least. So I hope that's given you a sort of feel, if you like, for some of the Roman sites being investigated. And indeed, we've had a whole flourish of Roman sites that have turned up all over the county over the last decade, and again, some of those have been published through the Transactions, for example, a work that was undertaken in advance the extension of the council's highways depot in Craven Arms, for example, again published in the Transactions. And my final case study for today is some work that's been undertaken in the last 5 years or so in Knockin, in Western Shropshire, village of Knockin, along the B4396 towards the Luncliffe Crossroads to the west here, and towards Nestcliff to the east. And this is in many ways typical of many Shropshire's villages, rural settlements. We have a collection of listed buildings within the village, strung out along the settlement. We have a scheduled monument within the centre of the village, and that's focused on the former Motte and Bailey Castle, and quite a large sort of area designation of a conservation area as well, which recognises its development as an historic settlement. But Shropshire is typical of the UK, England, the UK in general, that there is pressure for new housing within the community. The need to accommodate young people, young families, and provide new accommodation for households in the village, and that resulted in 2015 in what's known as a site allocation within the village, and that's this area marked in purple here, which was identified as an area for potential new houses to build. There's a relatively recent housing estate in this part of the village, and this kind of adjoins it. So to the planners seemed like a logical area to accommodate new development. And that's the site that was allocated here. It's accommodating within it this listed building sites here. That's not to say that was going to be demolished. It's just accommodated within the site. And again, we've got a listed war memorial down here in the if you like, the southeastern corner of the site. But we were able, within that broad boundary, to accommodate development as part of that local planning process. And as I say, the site was allocated, identified and allocated for development through that local plan making process. We've got a certain amount of information about the site. We know that the Motte and Bailey over to the east of the development site here was founded in the medieval period by Guy Lestrange. The Lestrange is one of the preeminent landowning families in the county, and we know that the castle at Knockin was founded by Guy Lestrange between 1154 and 60, and indeed remains the main holding of the Lestrange family throughout the medieval period. The Lestranges were closely aligned with the FitzAlans, who were the lords of the Oswestry Marcher Lordship, and acted as stewards on behalf of the Lestranges, stewards of Oswestry Castle for many years. And there's a very close relationship between those landowning aristocratic families. But by 1540, John Leyland is describing the castle as being in a ruinous state. As I say, the site was allocated in 2015. That's an aerial shot of the site. You can see that's sort of largely a sort of greenfield site, if you like, backplot area of orchard lands to the rear of the listed farmhouse here, but largely a greenfield site. That's it from the roadside, and it came to our attention largely because of this sort of sunken hollow way, as we thought of it at the time, that is followed by a modern right of way running through the site here, and it also has this pronounced sort of raised area within it as well. So in terms of, it had some quite interesting earthworks within it. So as part of the sort of allocation of this site, we were able to specify that, the preliminary discussions prior to its formal allocation in 2015, we're able to identify this because of its position within the centre of this village, proximity to the castle, and the earthworks that were visible on the site itself, that this was going to require archaeological investigation prior to its development. So we're able to specify a geophysical survey investigation of this site in this instance, prior to sort of any further work being undertaken. And you can see the geophysical survey results here, largely quiet until you get into this area, and then it's picking up these quite significant parallel features within it. And that's an interpretation plot of the geophysics. So we're picking up again this green stripy area here. Again, we think of medieval plough furrows, furrows within the strip fields, demarking the different field strips. But also within this area, a series of potential ditches that were highlighted by that geophysical survey. And so we were able to specify an archaeological evaluation was going to be necessary to further investigate the results of those geophysical survey results. So we specified a series of excavation evaluation trenches within that development area. And in the in the western part of those trenches, it largely produced evidence of a series of pits, which from the finds appear to date largely to the 20th century. And that's a sort of trench plan of those. That's a typical sort of profile of one of those pits. But on the eastern side of the site, a much more interesting feature was revealed, and that proved to be a very substantial ditch, which was up to 7.5 meters wide and up to 2.4 meters deep. And from the very base of that ditch, we have a piece of medieval pottery was revealed. Indeed, within the ditch fills generally, was producing medieval pottery. And we had evidence also for a remnant bank area on the eastern side of that ditch. And that ditch appears to have been largely infilled by the end of the medieval period. So if we just go back to the trench plan, that's the trenches that were excavated in this area. And we picked up that ditch in both of these trenches. So we have the green line on here is the projected line of that ditch. So we have a very large, substantial ditch on that eastern side of the site. And that's the ditch under excavation. You can see there, you know, just the substantial size of that feature. We were also, because there was a right-of-way public footpath running through this site, weren't actually able to position an evaluation trench across that public right-of-way in 2014. So we specified a second phase of evaluation in 2017, and we'd begin, you know, by this time we'd started to get the details of a site layout and plan agreed through a planning application process. So we specified the need to excavate another evaluation trench here, and also within the garden area to the rear of the farm here. Now, these trenches proved to be, again, largely blank, just a series, in some instances, I think, of 20th century pitting. So very typical of what was going on, again, in the central part of the site here. But interestingly, Trench E here produced, again, evidence of a very substantial ditch feature. And this really puzzled us to a significant degree, because it directly underlay that public right-of-way, a public right-of-way which we thought was a typical sort of holloway feature running through the site, actually proved to be the sort of largely infilled remains of this very substantial ditch. But the dating of this seemed to be quite curious, because it appears to remain largely open into the post-medieval period, and indeed was producing largely post-medieval material from the fells. And it was substantial in the sense it was up to 4 meters wide, just over 4 meters wide, and up to 1.6 meters deep. You can see the 2-meter ranging rods here. So this is, you know, a really substantial ditch. It appears to have been recut up to 3 times, but as I say, it was only producing material dating to from the 16th century onwards. So it's a bit of a mystery why you would have such a substantial ditch present within the centre part of the village, really, into the post-medieval period. And from this, we were able to specify, some further final excavation and recording work here to make sure that we really got a better understanding of what these ditches were all about. So we specified within this area a strip map and record exercise on the site access area, and within this area in relation to one of the plots that was an access to one of the plots. Most of the rest of the area, and particularly we were able to negotiate that this ditch would remain undeveloped, largely undeveloped within the site. And that exercise took place in the watching brief and strip map and recording exercise took place last year in 2019, and produced evidence for a sort of range of medieval activity within it. So we have evidence for an internal medieval pit. That's this feature here with a series of stake holes around it, and also evidence for a medieval oven feature here as well. And you can see the sort of fired fired clay here, and this sort of evidence for a structure around it. So that's evidence for some form of settlement-related activity within what would have been the sort of inside area of the ditch, if you like, on the eastern side of that site. And in between, indeed, in between those ditches here. So you can see that the oven and the location here, and then the sort of substantial secondary ditch there. But interestingly, we were also able to excavate another section across this western ditch. And it was fortunate we did undertake that in further sort of excavation, just to really try and bottom out what was going on with this ditch, because it was still a bit of a mystery as to why you've got such a substantial ditch excavated in perhaps the 16th or 17th century on this site. And actually, from the base of that ditch, we were able to recover this fragment of green glazed medieval pottery, actually from the very bottom of the original ditch cut here. So this was, really quite significant, because it projected the date of that first construction of that ditch back into the medieval period proper. And this is typical of the sort of 11th and 12th century ceramics that we know of from elsewhere in Shropshire. So what this has really been able to tell us is to sort of refine and rewrite to a certain degree our understanding of development of Knocking as a village, because we had previously we had the castle's motte mound and site of the castle here with an outer bailey on the eastern side, and then what appeared to be quite a significant planned settlement developing to the west of the castle, with a noticeable distinction between the form of the plot boundaries here on this second edition Ordnance Survey map from about the turn of the 20th century, between the plots within the centre of the village here and these plots on the western end of the village. What we now think we have is what we previously thought to be the focus of the castle at the eastern end of the village here, but focused around a motte mound and a bailey on the east side. But what we now appear to have is a second bailey potentially on the west side of the castle, which is potentially quite substantial in its extent. And we know that it potentially extends into this area again, because there are some earthwork features in this northern undeveloped lands to the north here. So, projecting the line and the scale of our ditches that we were recovering on this development site into the northern part of this area, we potentially have a bailey extending around this side area. And given the changes in the plot boundaries possibly crossing the road, that there's every sign that this the bailey and the ditches in this area extend to the south of the road through the village here. And that then perhaps suggests that the original medieval core of the village, if you like, is focused on the western side here, and that's perhaps accounts for the differences in the plot boundaries that we're seeing between the western side here and the central part of the village. And perhaps the difference in the morphology and form of those boundaries represents if you like, a later medieval and post-medieval infilling of that original bailey associated with the 12th century castle in the latter part of the medieval and early post-medieval period. Okay, so that concludes my my lecture for today. I hope I've given you there a sort of overview of the kind of work myself and my colleagues have been engaged in, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today.